Hi everyone. Today we're going to start chapter 3. I hope y'all are doing well because this may be a fairly long video. I would like to tell you that because chapter 3 is a little involved, I will probably post another video. In fact, I will post another video of some things we don't get covered in this first video. I will tell you that you won't be nearly as confused, as it were, if you will read chapter 3 before watching the video. Having them together in tandem like that helps you understand and take in, if you will, the information contained within the chapter itself. So today we're going to talk about the differences between sacred and profane power, as well as the different forms of sacred power. And then when I do chapter 3, part 2, we're going to talk about some things. Well, we'll talk about Taoism, and something you've probably never heard of, I'm sure, and Anselm, and Lao Tzu, and the ontological argument, which is pretty interesting in and of itself. But when you read the chapter, you know what I mean. So let's get started if we can. When we're talking about religion, one of the biggest things you will find in any religion is some understanding of sacred power. Now, for some religious groups, it's a sacred being like God or goddesses or gods, plural. For others, you find out they believe in spirits that inhabit most of the natural world, if not all of the natural world. And sometimes you find out that the sacred power isn't considered anything in and of itself. It's something that runs through everything and everybody. And when I say everything, I mean everything. It runs through the earth and the trees and the rivers and the squirrels and the Milky Way and all of the other galaxies and universes that might be in play. So sacred power may not be what we expect it is. It really depends on what religious group you're looking at. But what is sacred power? For that matter, what's profane power? Because these are two things that we really need to understand. So let's start with the easy one, profane power. Profane power is quite simply everyday, ordinary, explainable human power. The Romans came up with this term profane. Actually, they would say profanum. Pro means before or in front of, and phanum, or fane in our case, refers to the temple. It means, so the word itself means before the temple. It's the power before you get in the temple. Well, what's a temple? Very simply, a temple is considered the dwelling place of sacred power. Now, this idea does not confine sacred power to the temple. It just says that this is its main place. And like anybody's dwelling place, if it's your house, it's your rules. Who has the power in your house? Well, some of you are younger and, 18, 19 years old, and you're going to say, my parents. And you'd be right. If their house, their rules. But think about where you live. If you live in a dorm room, if you've rented an apartment with some friends, in those houses, it's your rules, or you and your buddies' rules for that matter. But the fact is, the idea of profane power is that before you get to the dwelling place of the sacred, it's human power. That's all that it is. Ordinary, explainable power. For instance, if you pick up a ball and throw it across a field, you know exactly how that ball traveled from your hands across the field. If we have any physical science types watching, you know good and well that they could do that mass and force times acceleration and all of that and explain it very scientifically. That's great. We get human power. Cars, they're not magic. They run on horsepower. We can even explain that. All of that, profane power. Basically, if you can explain power, it's profane power. It's very simple. But what is sacred power? Well, sacred power is something we really don't understand. Sacred power never, I won't say never, but very often doesn't even look like what we would expect it to look. We try to explain it, but we never quite get there. Sacred power, in fact, sometimes looks like weakness. And you're thinking, what? How would it look like weakness? Well, in Christianity, for example, there's this idea that God, in the form of Jesus Christ, was actually executed. He was crucified on a cross. And that seems like to be a very weak spot indeed for someone who is considered a God, for someone who is considered to be the embodiment of sacred power. However, in the Christian religion, Christians believe that when Jesus Christ or God was at his most weakest, he was actually at his most powerful. So there are times when sacred power does look weak. There are times, very often, when sacred power is almost, it's invisible, so to speak. You can't see where it comes from. You can't see how it comes. It just simply appears. It's an odd thing when you think about it. Sacred power, most religions believe that sacred power is the power that gives life, that can actually create. And you're thinking, well, humans create. No, humans don't create. Humans can procreate. They can create life with things that are already in play. You have a male and a female, and they have the appropriate things needed to create a baby. They can do that. But first they need each other, and even then it's no guarantee. But they can't create in and of themselves, by themselves. It just doesn't work that way. There's an old story, and this is just a joke, so don't take it too seriously. But maybe this will help you understand. There were a group of scientists who were at the lab one day, and they were standing around outside talking about how great science was. And y'all don't get me wrong, I am a huge believer in science. Definitely a believer in science. But they were congratulating themselves, these scientists, and one of them said, yeah, it's amazing. We've gotten to the point where with, DNA and cloning and that type of thing, well, we can create people. We don't even need God anymore. Well, they're just kind of shooting the bull. They're not being real serious. But what they didn't realize is that God was about 5 feet away. And God said, hey guys, what's going on? Heard what you were saying. And of course, they were very nice people, these scientists, and very respectful. And they said, we didn't mean to be disrespectful or anything. It's just that we've come so far that we're getting to the point where we can create as well. And God said, well, I tell you what, why don't we have a contest? You guys create a male human. I'll create a male human. And we'll see which male human is the best at the end. So everybody agreed that this would be done. The scientists needed a lot more room than they had in this small lab, so they brought all their stuff outside, the test tubes and the Bunsen burners, and I don't know what all it does. You're asking the wrong person. And all the chemicals they needed. And they brought all that up and got it set up, and God waited patiently, of course. And then when they were all ready, the scientists came over to God and said, well, we'd like you to go first. We think that's only right and fair, and we do respect your power. Please don't misunderstand us." And God said, "Sure, I can do that." And then because they were outside, God kind of looked around, and there was a little bare patch in the lawn that had some dirt in it. So he went over there and he picked up a handful of dirt, does like this, and somehow he just forms a man. I mean, poof. Maybe there wasn't a poof, but there was a man. And it was the perfect man. Beautiful man. You couldn't have had a better looking or better being human male than the one God made. The scientists were suitably impressed, so that's fantastic. But it's our turn now. God said, "Absolutely, I'll go right ahead." So somebody goes over and turns on the machinery, and everything starts bubbling and vapors come up. And then one of the scientists goes over to that same dirt patch that God had been at and picks up a handful of dirt and starts to go over and pour it into a test tube. And God said, "Wait, wait, wait." And they turned around and said, "What?" He said, "Y'all have to make your own dirt." And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the difference between sacred power and human power, profane power. The fact is, the sacred power did make its own dirt. The sacred power came up with everything. Now, whether you call that sacred power God or Allah or Yahweh or the Tao or anything else, the sacred power is what provided the original ingredients, everything you had to have for life. The scientists hadn't figured out a way to do that. They couldn't create those ingredients that you needed. Like I said, don't take that story real seriously. I'm not trying to put down anybody's religion or religion in general or science in general. I'm a big old scientific believer, but I'm also a great big sacred believer. So there we go. It's just an illustration of how sacred and profane power differ. So when we talk about sacred power, there are a lot of different types of sacred power. And there's a lot of different understandings, I guess you'd call it, of sacred power. The one I want to start with first is something called animism. A-N-I, how do you spell it? A-N-I-M-I-S-M. Animism can be defined as religious practices and beliefs centering on the notion that spirits or souls inhabit and animate most natural phenomena. Now, if you're wondering, natural phenomena is anything that occurs naturally. Rocks, river, trees, squirrels, ducks, insects, people, for that matter, cats and dogs, anything found in nature. Nature is considered natural phenomena. This term animism was introduced by a British anthropologist named E.B. Tylor. I believe he introduced it in 1871. He had been studying, he was an anthropologist, and he studied spiritual and religious growth in human beings. And he came up with this idea. He said, Tylor said, our prehistoric ancestors probably decided that because when one goes to sleep or is knocked unconscious, one dreams, and in one's dream one can go anywhere in the world while you're asleep, that they probably believed that there was an inner spirit, an anime, as it were, that was inside each person. And this inner spirit, this anime, was able to step outside of the body of a person when they dreamt or when they were knocked unconscious, and even after they died. The spirit was able to leave the body. Once they began to believe this about humans, thought Tylor, then it was kind of an easy step to believing that everything that was naturally occurring had its own anime. And so everything in nature had a spirit that could leave the thing, I suppose, the naturally occurring thing, or come back to the naturally occurring thing. This is what Tyler believed that prehistoric people believed. Now, the thing is, if everything has a spirit, this is how Tyler thought about it, then people began to realize that they should propitiate or keep happy the spirits of everything in nature. Well, this sounds strange. What does that mean, to keep them happy? Well, maybe it's sacrifice. You can start by offering sacrifice to the natural phenomena, to the spirits you believe inhabit the natural phenomena. You can communicate with them. You can ask them to treat you well and not harmfully. Tell you what, let's pretend we're prehistoric people. And there is a pond right down from where you live. Next to this pond is a willow tree. And your job every morning is to go and get water and bring it back up to where you live. So you go down to the willow tree, because willow trees very often grow by the water, and you dip up some water and you take it back every morning. One day, however, you've had a very bad morning. You dropped some stuff on your toe. Somebody said you weren't bringing the water right. You were just in a cranky mood. So you go down to the pond, and while you're there, you trip and stub your toe, and it hurts, and you're so angry you just reach out and kick that willow tree. You get your water, and you're going back home. But the willow tree is not happy. Remember, this anime within the willow tree, its spirit does not appreciate being kicked. And the spirit bides its time. Next morning, you come down once again to get the water for the willow tree. And the willow tree says, I'm going to get this sucker back, and drops a limb right on your head. Yeah. The fact is, the willow tree was able to repay your unkindness with unkindness of its own. Maybe from there you decided, I'd better be nice to this willow tree. I don't want it dropping a limb on my head every time I come down to get water. So every morning when you get water, you start to do things like maybe the first dipper of water you come up with goes on the roots of the willow tree. Willow trees love water, and you know this, so you make them happy. Perhaps you greet the willow tree. Perhaps you do everything you possibly know to do to keep that spirit within the willow tree happy. This is animism. And E.B. Tyler thought that religion started with this animistic idea, and eventually animism evolved into polytheism, the belief in many gods and goddesses. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Then he believed that polytheism eventually evolved into monotheism. Well, it kind of sounds good. I won't lie about it. It does. And certainly animism is older than polytheism, and polytheism is older than monotheism. But it doesn't mean because we have monotheists that they all started out as animists. In fact, there are some people groups in the world today that still practice a form of animism. So probably not. You see, the big issue with E.B. Tyler's theory about this evolving and animism being the origin of all religion is that we just don't have supporting evidence. Certainly not enough. We don't know what our prehistoric ancestors believed. Remember, if you're prehistoric, this is before history was written down. We just don't have any idea what they really believed. What we do know is that there are animistic people groups out there even today, but we still don't know what those particular people groups believed in prehistorical times. So it just doesn't, there's just a lack of evidence for the idea that animism is the key to all religions. So, what's next? Well, animism is interesting because one thing that it has that you still see in certain traditions, even if they're not animistic traditions, is that they have this idea of ancestor spirits. Now, very often, more attention is paid in animism to the spirits of the natural world, but the spirits of those who died become very important to some people in some religious traditions. If you've ever seen the movie Mulan, yes, the Disney movie Mulan, you'll notice that her ancestor spirits are all over the place. Most of them spend most of their time in the temple, right? And they talk about her and what she should do and what she shouldn't do. But the fact is, the spirit itself was believed to live on long after the body had perished. So there is a type of veneration in many Chinese religions, actually, and as well as some animistic religions of ancestor spirits. This does not necessarily mean that the ancestor spirits are worshipped. It is more of veneration and reverence than actual worship. It's a matter of degree, honestly. Worship is a little bit higher, a little bit more important, if you will. So there is that idea. Um, it's an interesting idea, and people in many different religions believe that one's spirit lives on after the body dies. Some believe that the spirit goes to an afterlife somewhere else. Others believe that the spirit hangs around here. But the big idea of ancestor spirits, or even those who die and don't believe necessarily that the ancestor spirits hang around, is that the dead no more. We have this idea, even in the Western world, we believe that when people die, they find out the truth of things, the reality of things. But, well, I shouldn't say but because that doesn't make sense. You see this a lot in things like the Day of the Dead in the Mexican tradition. This is an idea that you honor your family's spirits of your dead loved ones. You pay them honor and homage, and you talk to them as if they are there. Many people groups have a Day of the Dead type celebration within their religious calendars. Shoot, the ancient Egyptians built entire cities for their dead monarchs. They believe that the spirit hangs on in some manner. So this is a very normal thing to see across the world, although it does come in different forms. The next thing we need to talk about is totemism. What's a totem? Totem. Well, it comes from an Ojibwa word, ototem, Ototem, kind of like possum and opossum, right? But a totem is usually an animal, but sometimes a plant or a heavenly body that embodies the spiritual essence of a group. And totemism involves the recognition of a relationship between a certain totem and a group of people. And it may be a big group of people, it may be a small group of people, but it's a group of people. The totem becomes sacred to the group, and it is not to be killed by its members except under very ritualized and sacred conditions. Well, what does that mean? That's a little strange, isn't it? What's even more strange, at least to our idea, is that it's often believed that the people group, whether it's a clan or a tribe or just a family, somehow descended from the totem. And in fact, a totem is often called the first ancestor of a group. Now, they don't mean that if the totem is an animal, that the family physically descended from this totem. It happened in some sacred spiritual way. It's sacred power. You can't explain it. They can't explain it, but they can say that it did happen, and it does happen. Usually, totemism involves the identification with a specific animal, as I said. There are certain things about that animal, certain characteristics of the animal that the family, we'll call it the family just for ease, would like to have. But excuse me, I lost my place for a minute. But those specific characteristics will depend upon the animal itself. For instance, maybe your totem is the wolf. If your totem is the wolf, you might appreciate the wolf for its speed and its agility, for its ability to get whatever food it needs to get. You might appreciate the wolf for being an apex predator. These are the type of things you need in your life to help your family and yourself survive. It's a very normal thing. Kessler has a really interesting conversation in this part of his book. He talks about the fact that sports mascots are kind of similar to totems. And when we think about that, we might think about, let's look at the Carolina Panthers. It's a football team. Why would a football team want a mascot like a panther? Well, if we look at the characteristics of a panther, it might help us explain. Perhaps the football team, in some ways, are hoping they can take on some of these characteristics. They could be agile, very fast, very powerful. They can run super quickly, right? They've got the ability to leap upon their enemies and stop them. What football team wouldn't want all that? And then, of course, they've got the jaws that bite and the claws that catch. That's for all of you Alice in Wonderland people out there. But I can understand why there are characteristics that a football team would want to have that would match the characteristics of a panther. It makes perfect sense to me. Emil Durkheim. Here's another important name for you. He lived from 1858 to 1917. And he studied totemism in Australian Aborigines, Australian First People groups, you could say. And he believed that it was totemism and not animism that was the origin of religion. He believed that because the totem embodied a social group, this was very important. He thought that all sacred powers are symbols for the social power of the group to control or shape or change the individual. He said that the humans understood, especially our prehistoric humans, understood that survival depends on the survival of the group. The spirit of the group is embodied within the totem, and when you worship the totem, you're actually worshiping the group in symbolic form. Most scholars today don't agree with this. They do understand that totems play an important role in the classifying social groups, and the group itself would play an important role in survival. But quite honestly, it has the same issue that E.B. Tyler's idea of the origin of religion being animism had. We don't have supporting evidence. We just don't know. So it's really, while Durkheim, Emil Durkheim was correct in assuming that the social group is very important, we can't prove it. It's just the way it is. So the next one we want to talk about is henotheism. No, it's not. I take that back. I've gotten ahead of myself. It's polytheism. Well, polytheism, as I'm sure you know, is the belief in many gods/goddesses. Sure. Polytheism occurred in many religions and has throughout history. Most of the time in polytheism, the gods are organized according to cosmic regions. This means that there's gods of the sky, they're gods of the mountains, they're gods of the rivers, there's gods of the underworld, gods of the sea. Yeah, in many sense, gods in polytheism are gods of place. What's interesting is that if you take a god from their particular area to another particular area, they usually weaken when they're moved to a place where they're not usually the god of. For instance, if you took, Poseidon, the god of the sea, from the ocean and put him on a mountain, he would not retain as much power as he had as the god of the sea. And the god of that mountain, whoever it might be, would probably be more powerful from him. However, if you took the god of the mountain and put him in the ocean with Poseidon, the god of the mountain wouldn't have the type of power that Poseidon had in the ocean. Makes sense. Polytheistic gods are often related in pantheons, P-A-N-T-H-E-O-N. A pantheon is simply a divine family tree. When you study polytheism, they have mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles and cousins. They're all kind of related in this great big family, if you will. It's probably one of the most dysfunctional families you ever read about. If you just look at the Greek and Roman gods, that was an extraordinarily dysfunctional bunch of gods. They were cheating on each other, they were stealing from and lying to each other. The myths are really interesting to read. They acted a lot like some human families that we know. Polytheistic gods are often described anthropomorphically. Now, this is one of my favorite terms. I just love this word. Let me spell it for you real quick. anthropomorphically, anthropomorphically. Basically, they're described as having human characteristics. They're like humans, but with more power. And this is literally, the term means in human form. But they're not just humans. There's so much more to them, and they have so much more power. When we talk about polytheistic gods, the big question that academics talk about about all of these gods is that, are they all really completely different sacred beings, or are they all one God in different guises, with different faces, so to speak? This is the way the book puts the question. Do they manifest a single divine sacred power pervading the heavens and earth? Kessler gives you a fairly easy answer. I don't quite agree with him. I'm going to tell you the truth, not completely. Kessler believed that the gods form something of a single species, well, but they're different deities. He thought each god was its own individual person. I don't disagree with him completely, because in some cultures, the polytheistic gods were considered that, completely separate and independent. However, in other polytheistic cultures, the gods weren't completely separate. If you look at the Baals of the Canaanites in the Old Testament, you'll find out that the Baals were really considered different faces of the one great Baal. But they talk about him, and they give their myths and stories about the Baals as if they were separate, independent gods. So it's just not very cut and dried, I guess, is the idea. In some places Kessler is correct, and in other places he isn't. So that's polytheism, which leads us to something called henotheism. Henotheism. Henotheism means to believe in many gods, but to worship only one. That's an interesting idea. It's not that you're saying that there are no gods, but you worship this particular one, whichever one that may be. Kessler points out quite accurately that this was the case among the earliest Hebrew people. Something you might find interesting, worshiping only one God, was actually more of a process in the Hebrews' very earliest religion than it was an event. I'm sure that you have all heard about Father Abraham, who lived in Mesopotamia in a place called Ur, between the Tigris and Euphrates River, and he grew up worshiping multiple gods. Everybody there did. The Babylonians in that area, he was in Babylonia, were polytheists. But one day, Abraham hears this voice telling him to pack up and leave. And he catches on pretty quick that it's a God, but when he asks, "What God are you? What's your name?" this voice says, "I am," or in Hebrew, Yahweh, or as we would say in English, Yahweh. Now that Yahweh honestly isn't really a name. This voice is saying, "It's me." You can translate that term, I am who I am, but you can also translate it as I will be whom I will be, or I was who I was. Basically, this voice is saying, you don't need a name for me. I'm the only one. I'm it. And that's how Abraham began to understand that there was only one God, not all the multiple gods that he'd been accustomed to since his childhood. So he believed pretty quickly, and he gathered up his family, and they took off for this land that they had been promised by I am. But you can't legislate belief. And so while Abraham believed quite quickly, members of his family for generation upon generation didn't believe quite so quickly. They believed in the God of Abraham, but they also believed in the gods of the Canaanites or in the gods of the Mesopotamians. That's how it worked. It took a long time before that early Hebrew religion, starting with Abraham, became Judaism. And some people believed completely and others didn't. And if you start looking throughout the Old Testament, very often people would, especially in bad times, the people would leave off worshiping Yahweh and turn to their Canaanite neighbors' gods, the Baals. And then they'd go back again. That's henotheism, which is often considered a bridge between polytheism and monotheism. Just because you have a rule that says we're only going to worship this one doesn't mean everybody will follow the rule. Let's switch tactics just a little bit here. Let's talk about demons. Demons, generally, we perceive demons to be superhuman powers that can cause harm. That's a pretty good average definition of a demon. Now, it isn't always so. In fact, your book tells you that in some places, like Bali, there's a belief that demons actually work for the benefit of humans. But the basic idea of a demon is that it's a being who is probably not, but still could be, as powerful as a god, but is still more powerful than a human. That makes sense, right? And very often they're considered evil or bad or mean. That makes sense. Kessler says that demons in one religion are oftentimes the gods that were deposed or thrown out when new gods came to power. And he uses the example of Pan to illustrate this. Now, Who's Pan? Pan was the little goat-footed boy in Greek and Roman religion. If you'll remember him, he had from the waist up, he looked like a human, except probably very often depicted with some horns on his head. And from the waist down, he had the legs and hindquarters of a goat. Well, you're thinking, so what? How did that become the image of Satan for Christians, as Kessler says? In the 1st and 2nd centuries, in what we call Israel now, the Romans had brought in the worship of their gods. They were running the country at that time. They built temples to Pan. And one of the ways they worshipped Pan was with sacrifice, as many religions did. However, Pan sacrifice, they didn't sacrifice animals. They sacrificed babies. You can imagine that this didn't go over real well with the norm. And when Christianity began to grow throughout the Roman Empire and throughout Israel, and the Greek and Roman religion is dying out, it's not that far out of the realm of belief that Christians would begin to see Satan as looking like Pan. And if you look at how we usually depict Satan in artwork, he has hooves like a goat and horns and a tail. He looks like a really evil, mean Pan. And so that makes sense when we say the deposed god, like Pan, becomes our picture of the chief demon in Christianity. And that's where that comes from. It's kind of an interesting idea. Then we come to monotheism. Monotheism, very easily, is simply the belief in one God. In monotheism, there's two basic types. The first one is called Unitarianism, and the second is called Trinitarianism. Unitarian monotheism says that the nature of the one God is in absolute unity. God has no divisions. God has no parts. Judaism and Islam are both monotheistic, Unitarian monotheistic religions. Some forms of Christianity are also Unitarian, but we won't get into that now. Just if you remember that Judaism and Islam are Unitarian monotheists, that'll help you out. It's very simple. Whereas Christians would say there's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, Jewish people wouldn't say that, nor would Islamic people. In fact, that's a very big thing with the Jewish people. That was a huge stumbling block to their belief in Jesus when people said that Jesus was God, because they were monotheists. And to them, saying that God had these separate personages, that went against their very strict monotheism that they had developed in their religion by that point. Now, Trinitarianism is what we see in most forms of Christian denominations. Trinitarianism says that the nature of the one and only God is a triunity. Kessler puts it that God is three persons in one divine nature. You could say it that way, but I don't think it completely covers the understanding. Most Christians believe that, yes, there are three persons in one divine nature, but these three persons are individually and singularly God, as well as being God when they're all in that one divine nature. But yet they can't be separated, except when you talk to them separately. Let me tell you something. I believe in the Trinity, but it's our best human understanding of the nature of God. we can't expect to be able to explain this. It's something that has to be believed or not. So it's a very difficult idea to explain that. The Hindus actually have a form of a Trinitarian point of view in their religion. It's called the Trimurti, Trimurti. The Trimurti says that the gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are combined. They're the three God. They're one God with three faces. Brahma is the creator. Vishnu is the preserver or sustainer, and Shiva is the destroyer. Now that sounds very strange to us, but remember they believe that Brahman, the creator, creates a world and then goes and creates another world somewhere else. And Vishnu, the preserver, Vishnu is the one that is there with you at all times. Vishnu is the one that's with you through your whole life on earth and for everybody else as well. And as far as Shiva, why would you worship Shiva? Why would you worship a destroyer? Because this God destroys worlds, because it's a loving destruction. Shiva destroys worlds that are sick, that are old and decrepit, and it hurts. There's more pain in them than there is good. So in some ways, Shiva destroys a world when it's like your poor old sick dog that just lives in pain every day. Puts the world out of its misery, so to speak. That's the idea. I won't get too much into that. You can read about it in your book, of course, and understand it a little bit more. But that's what it is. On kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, let's talk about deism. D-E-I-S-M. These are people, or I shouldn't say these are people, that sounds wrong. People who are deist believe in monotheism. They are Unitarian monotheists, but they're the type of Unitarians that believe that the deity is not involved with the everyday pattern of your life. Quite a few of our founding fathers were deists. Thomas Jefferson was one. It's based on the belief that God created the universe, but then, after setting up the physical laws of nature, God went elsewhere. And the universe, he'd set it up to get on by itself, and so it did. They do not believe that God acts in history, in the unfolding of history. They do not believe God is someone that you pray to and ask God to change the laws of nature just to help you. In fact, they think in some ways that this is unfair, that it's a selfish thing to ask God to change things to help you, because for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, which means if it helps you, it might hurt another person. I don't know if there's some validity to that or not. Deism was very popular in the 18th century, especially in Europe and North America. Like I said, some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, was deist. Was not an unusual idea back then. And if you think about the fact that this is occurring right during the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, you can see why we have this idea. We have science becoming much more scientific and becoming much more apt to be used in everyday life, and people want explanations. And so this idea that if you need anything in life, if you want anything in life, you must pray about it, is kind of being shoved to the side and saying, no, you have to take care of things yourself to a certain degree. This is like an attitude that's developing in academic circles. And of course, it starts to flow out from the academic and elite circles down to the common person. So that's deism. coming out of monotheism, then, we have something called dualism, D-U-A-L-I-S-M. Dualism, very, very easily, is simply the belief in two gods. In strict dualism, it's believed that these two gods have equal power, but their power is completely oppositional to one another. In other words, there's a good God and an evil God, and they have the exact same amount of power. A very good example of this comes from an ancient religion of Persia, or Iran as we call it today, called Zoroastrianism. That's the English term. Zoroastrianism was founded by a name like Zarathustra, or Zoroaster in English, maybe as early as 1000 BC. Today, the religion's known as Parsi, and there are very few Parsi anymore. There's only about 500,000 of them, and they live in India as a general rule. But the origin story goes this way. Zarathustra received a revelation from the god Ahura Mazda, who's known as the supreme god. Because of these revelations, Zoroaster began to reform Persian polytheism. Ahura Mazda said, "No, there aren't many gods. There's only me, but I have two spirits. I have my good and holy spirit, Spenta Mainyu, and I have my evil spirit, Angra Mainyu, and humans must choose which of these spirits they will follow." Now, Zoroaster didn't originally treat this as a very strict dualism. He believed that eventually, in the fullness of time, Spenta Mainyu, the good spirit, would win out. But later, as time went on, as the centuries go by, the religion kind of evolved into a very strict dualism. And now they believe there is a never-ending warfare between Spenta Mainyu and Angra Mainyu, and one will never win out against the other because they are so equal in power. Interestingly enough, some Christians have kind of a limited dualism, but in traditional classical Christianity, that's monotheistic. It is not dualistic, because the people who say that Christianity is a type of dualism, they would have to say that God and Satan had equal power. And most Christians do not believe that and haven't since the very beginning. So it really doesn't work for that. The next type of sacred power we're going to talk about is pantheism, and followed by monism, which is quite similar. The word pantheism, P-A-N-T-H-E-I-S-M, means all God, literally. And it says that the essence of the universe is divine, the sum total of the universe, everybody within and without of the universe, all of that is divine. All of us are divine and sacred, just like the squirrels and the trees and the possums and the rocks and all the universes. Pantheistic ideas deny that any deity or God is greater than or outside of the universe. Pantheism denies this idea of supernatural transcendence. Supernatural transcendence simply means that there is no particular God or sacred power that is separated from everything else. Benedict Spinoza, a very big adherent to this view, was a Jewish Dutch philosopher. He lived from 1632 to 1677. He had originally been from, I can't remember if it's Portugal or Spain offhand. But he, as he got older, abandoned traditional Jewish monotheism. He'd grown up in a nice Jewish household, and he became convinced that everything, everything was a part of one substance, of one essence. He called this substance or essence, he called it God. Sometimes he called it nature. But he said that it doesn't create, it doesn't listen to prayers, it doesn't act in the unfolding of history. Probably the best example that modern types like us might think of with this is that pantheism is very much like the Force in Star Wars. It runs through everything, and everything is a part of the Force, but the Force is also a part of everything. Marcus Aurelius, I don't know if you know who that is, but he was a Roman statesman, or was he Greek statesman? I think he was a Roman statesman, as well as a philosopher. He lived from 121 to 180. He was also a student of Cicero. And he did some writing based on Cicero's teachings that ascribes to the idea that God is identical to the rational order of the universe, what the Greeks called the logos. We would spell it Logos. Now, this was an idea that had been around for quite some time, a couple of 300 years anyway, that the rational order of the universe was actually the sacred power. And if you want to look at something really interesting, if you have a Bible or if you don't have one, look in the New Testament at the Gospel of John and read the first few verses. It starts out, the Word was God, the Word was with God. Why am I bringing that up? Because the New Testament was written in Greek, and the author of that particular gospel was writing to a Greek audience and trying to explain the person of Jesus to this Greek audience. And he used the word word. Well, so what? Well, the word he actually used in Greek was logos. Logos can be translated as word or even thing, but word is a very normal translation for it. And so what he was trying to do is use a pre-existing religious idea like logos that his audience would already understand to help explain a new religious idea like Jesus. I just think it's really interesting to look at that. But that's where he was going with that. He was saying, you've heard about the Word, you know what the logos is, you know about the rational order of the universe, but it's embodied in this guy called Jesus. Now, you may not be a Christian, you may not believe any of this at all, and that's fine. You don't have to believe it, but I do want you to understand it. And that's why I say if you really want to see how this happened, if you look in the Gospel of John, it's just a very interesting way that an older religion is being used to help support a newer religion. Then we come to monism. Now, there's a couple of different types of monism. Monism is very similar to pantheism, but it's more of the idea that everything is of a piece, so to speak. There was a man named Plotinus, Plotinus. He lived from 204 to 270. And he said that the sacred power is actually just one ultimate power from which all other, what he called principles, emanate. It's kind of like rays of light coming off of the sun. These rays are also a part of the sun. They are not separate. Plotinus called this the ultimate reality. Sometimes he called it the one. He said that the ultimate reality, or the one, doesn't create the world out of nothing. It doesn't create it ex nihilo. But somehow the world is created from this particular essence. Somehow these rays take on their own shape, but they still remain part of the one. actually, there's in the Hindu context, you get to this idea as well. In Hinduism, they'll refer to the claim that there's no difference between the essence of individual consciousness, or your spirit, your soul, if it were, that they call the Atman, and the essence of the universe, they call that the Brahman, which is also the Brahman, that's the creator God. Everything is one. There is no difference. So that's a whole lot of understanding of different forms of sacred power. Real quick, let's talk about two things that really aren't about sacred power. Let's start with agnosticism. Agnosticism, literally translated, it means not knowing. And that's what agnosticism means. It's the idea that humans cannot know about divine powers, particularly whether or not divine powers actually exist. So agnosticism is not atheism. They're not saying there is no sacred, there is no divine. People who are agnostic say, I don't know, maybe. It's a questioning type of idea. It's a searching type of idea for some people. Now, there is a form of agnosticism called evidentialism. Evidentialism says that it's wrong to believe any statement on the basis of inadequate evidence. William Clifford came up with this idea. And when he talks about inadequate evidence, he's taking a very courtroom view of evidence, if you will. In other words, in a Western courtroom, you may have somebody who has been brought up on charges for, I don't know, robbing a bank. But if the prosecutor can't prove the charges, you have to find them not guilty. It would be wrong to convict somebody when the evidence does not support it enough. I mean, we all know that, right? So this evidentialism is saying, since we can't prove God based on the evidence, it would be wrong to believe in a God. And I'm using God as kind of shorthand for any type of sacred power right now. Clifford said it's always wrong to believe anything about insufficient evidence. Always. He said that non-empirical superhuman entities, like God, are beyond the reach of human minds, and so we shouldn't believe in them because they can't be proven. That's what he thought. Now, not all agnostics think that way. Obviously, many agnostics are searching and trying to find out for themselves if there is sacred power or not. But that was William Clifford and evidentialism idea. And then, of course, there's atheism. Atheism very simply means no God. Notice that the last part of atheism is theism, which means God. Every time you see theos, theism, it means God. You put an A or an "an" in front of something like that, and it means no or none or not. So atheism is no God or not God, if you want to look at it that way. It's a very simple idea, just that there is no sacred power. The only power in the world is profane power. There is this idea by Ludwig Feuerbach that God is a projection of idealized humanity. In other words, and what's his name? Sigmund Freud actually came up with this idea. He and one of his students, who was it? Oh, Carl Jung. It's J-U-N-G, not Y-O-U-N-G. But this idea is that we create God in our own image. Sigmund Freud said that as people were born, they had a need of a perfect parent. And so they created this idea of a perfect parent in their mind. But as they grew up, they realized that their parents weren't perfect. But they still had this need that had never been fulfilled. So they slap a title on it, like God. And it's simply a projection, as he said, of something that is needed that you don't get. His student Carl Jung believed the same thing, except that Carl Jung said that individual people don't do this. This is part of a collective unconscious of the entire human race from the time there was a human race. He said that we all have these ideas of unfulfilled desires, unfulfilled needs and wants, and everybody has the same idea, but it's held in this collective unconscious that, act like pattern cards. So when we say God, we're thinking of a pattern card of the perfect parent, and none of humanity has the perfect parent, so we call it God, and that's why we want a perfect parent. So today I'm going to stop there, and on the next video, which includes the rest of chapter 3 that I didn't cover, we are going to talk about, as I said earlier, Anselm, the ontological argument. We're going to talk about Lao Tzu and Taoism. And so look for that video. I don't know if I'll get to it today or not, but it will appear shortly. Have a great day, and I hope everybody makes it through this ice storm we're expecting today actually. I'll talk to you later. Stay warm.